Good morning, guys. Welcome to AP World History. We've already talked this morning, so you guys have seen me. We've had a little chance to talk to Dr. Graber, to talk about just a few things that were kind of pressing. And one of those things that was really important that Dr. Graber noticed while reading your summer assignments was the identification of bias and the different types of bias. So today's video, or this first video that you guys are going to watch today, is all about bias. So you guys are going to see on your screen the document that I will be sharing with you, or that you already have access to by this point. And so let's just go through and talk about the bias. So you'll see this lovely, wonderful cartoon that brings attention and awareness to biases and how easy it is to be fooled. So it says 86.4% of people will believe any data you put in a PowerPoint slide, even if you just totally made it up to prove your point. So 86.4% of you just believe that was a correct statistic, even though it was made up. All right, so we'll talk about those. And so the first one that we're going to talk about is going to be confirmation bias. And this is going to be seen in statistics and in history. And so that occurs when people performing the data analysis want to prove a predetermined assumption. Then they keep looking in the data until the assumption can be proven. An example, by intentionally excluding particular variables from the analysis. This often occurs when data analysts are briefed in advance to support a particular conclusion. So say, for instance, whoever your historian is, or the person that you're gathering your information from, your source, they're saying, hey, I really want to show that the most important beverage to come in prehistory time is going to be water. And so I'm going to exclude all other examples that show that water is not important. So if they're making beer, or if they're making wine, or if they're making whatever that is, I'm going to exclude it because it's not relevant to the story that I'm trying to tell as a historian or as a teacher. Okay, so just be aware that people sometimes can say, hey, I want this conclusion to happen, so therefore I'm going to exclude all the other information so that I prove that this actually happened. Number 2 is the selection bias. This occurs in statistics and in history. This occurs when data is selected subjectively. As a result, the sample used is not a good reflection of the population. This error is often made in surveys. Frequently, there is also selection bias in customer panels. The customers that you easily find willing to participate in a customer panel are far from being average customers. So that's like saying, hey, I'm only going to look for the information that fits my narrative. So I'm going to say, hey, if I'm trying to prove that bears are the most important animal and in the forest or in the food chain, or they control everything, I'm only going to select information about bears. I'm going to exclude information about mountain lions. I'm going to exclude information about any other type of animal that might disprove my point that bears are the most important animal in the forest. I hope you guys agree with me. Bears are cuddly. They're like pandas. Those are bears. Koala bears, black bears, brown bears, polar bears. All those bears are really important. But you know who's not important? Mountain lions. All right, so that's what I mean by selection bias. So you're going to intentionally focus on one group and ignore another part of the population. Sometimes you see that. We'll see that throughout history. We'll see a lot of men's perspectives and not so many women's perspectives. There were definitely women around in our historical times, but unfortunately the sources were only looking to hear the male voice or the male point of view on what was going to happen. So that is one bias that you guys will see a lot, especially in the early history portions. Men kind of rule supreme, unfortunately or fortunately, depending on how you look at history. Okay. Number 3 is the self-serving bias. This is a common bias in history, particularly in personal diaries. The author wants you to prove their own value, their wealth, things like that. So one of my favorite examples of this is going to be the Palace of Versailles. So the Palace of Versailles, we'll talk about this more throughout history. It was where the Louis lived in France. So Louis the 14th, 15th, and 16th. Louis the 14th is going to build Versailles. Louis the 15th is going to enjoy Versailles, and Louis the 16th is going to die for Versailles. Well, when you go there, there is this beautiful, beautiful statue of Louis the 15th. And when you see him, he's riding his horse, and he looks buff, and he looks strong, and he looks so put together. But then when you actually see a portrait of him, you are like, not at all the person I was expecting to see based on what was presented to me. So because he had authority and power and wealth, he was able to portray himself in a very, very fit, athletic manner, when in actuality he was kind of short and not so fit. So that's self-serving bias. I want to be seen as the best, the greatest, the only. Those things are going to come across throughout history when we see different sources by different people. We're saying, hey, I did all these wonderful things. Everyone should praise me. All right. The fourth one is going to be the curse of knowledge and hindsight bias. Once again, the curse of knowledge and hindsight bias. Did the author understand some facts when they originally observed it? Or did they subsequently learn critical information that changed their view of the facts or issues? So sometimes when you're gathering information, you might have this idea of what the information is going to look like. And then when it all comes around, you're like, hey, maybe in hindsight, I should have included certain additional categories because they might have actually helped build my narrative or build my case much better. But I'm at the end now, so I don't have time to go back. So thinking about those things, is there something the person forgot when they were first starting their research? Well, how about at the end of the research? Were they able to say, hey, I forgot some things. Maybe I should go back and change my narrative? Did they actually do that? Probably not. And that's where we're going to lead to the curse of knowledge and hindsight bias. That thing where it says, hindsight is always 20/20. So when you're looking back and you're thinking about things, you're like, man, now that I've done this, I can see how I could have done it differently. So that's the same thing that applies to number 4. All right, let's go to number 5. So number 5 is the optimism and pessimism bias. So if you're optimistic, you think that everything is always going to go well. If you're pessimistic, you think that everything is always going to go wrong. Did the author view the situation through rose-colored glass? Or was their negative worldview, or did their negative worldview make it impossible to evaluate independently? So if you're looking at a source and they're like, man, the world is ending, the world is horrible, there is nothing positive that could ever happen. I don't know if I want to trust their source or their view about life or about society or about things like that, because they have a pretty pessimistic or negative view about how things are going to happen. But the reverse of that, if someone is saying, oh man, everything's going to happen just because it's supposed to happen like this and right on time, I'm also going to be a little bit cautious with that person too, because I'm like, optimism is wonderful, but is that always how things happen in history? And most times you'll see that, human nature, there's going to be good things that happen, there's going to be bad things that happens, but it's never one thing completely. It's never 100% bad or 100% good. And so therefore, when we look at our sources, we have to think about those things like, hey, are you being too pessimistic? Hey, are you being too optimistic when you're talking about a certain source? And the further we go into the semester, this one will make more and more sense. But I think in your own life, you can kind of see people who are optimistic or pessimistic and how that plays. Number 6 is the decline bias. So in the past, things were better than they are now. This is going to lead us kind of directly into into the assignment for the day. So you're going to kind of look and see if hunting-gatherers were better off than people who were sedentary and stationary. So I'm going to say, back in the 1960s, people were more unified. Everything was more together. There was more love. And today in 2020, people are just so angry and I don't know, we're just not where we were back in the day. So that's kind of saying, hey, I see the past better than I see the future. So the decline bias means that I can't necessarily be trusted to talk about the future in a unbiased way, because I already feel like the future is worse than the past used to be. All right, and the final one is going to be the in-group bias. So number 7 is the in-group bias. One's perceptions about people who are similar to themselves in their own group are frequently more positive. Those outside the group are viewed more negatively. Such groups can be based on gender, race, religion, nationality, music preference, food preference, favorite sports, etc., things like that. I think one of the easiest ones to highlight is the racial bias that we sometimes have. So sometimes minority groups can say, hey, I love everybody who is in my minority group, but if you're different, I'm going to look at you a little bit strangely. That may not be a viewpoint that you guys have, but I know that probably in your life you have experienced certain things. I know that when I was growing up, I kind of had to get on my grandparents like, hey, why are we so biased against these certain groups when there's not really much of a difference? We're just different races. So those things are definitely going to come into play. If it was more modern history, we'd have more about sexuality and things like that. But for some of our prehistory and our older things that we're talking about in this class, gender, race, religion, nationality, those things are going to be the focal points. I personally might have a bias against people who listen to heavy metal, or those who like volleyball, or those who like bananas. Okay, ugh, disgusting. So all of those things can make people biased against you. And so we just want you to think about these 7 things, and you will have plenty of time to look at them on your own. But start factoring in these biases into your evaluation of sources and how you see things. So make sure that you check these out, read these, get in touch with these, and good luck, and everything's going to be great. All right, so I hope you enjoyed this video.